I really appreciated all the hard work, all this cast and crew they put into trying to pay homage to this classic, obviously. Um, but the effort is definitely not lost on me. They hired designers from real Inuit tribes to create waterbender costumes. They had indigenous elders to consult with. Their music was sourced from abroad instead of LA. The composer, Takashi Furukawa, I think, yeah. He composed it, and he said it was really important to me that we got to go to people who breathe the air and drink the water of that area. And, I really got to give it to them. They really did their best. They did their research, and I appreciated that. I definitely saw that. That wasn't lost on me. What I was really upset about, and what I think everybody's really upset about, is that was kind of overshadowed by a misunderstanding, I think, in the writing room. Yeah. And the narrative, we kind of lost the narrative along the way, hence finding the narrative. So what I loved, and what I think we all loved about the original show, was these complex characters that each got to go through a full arc. The creative writing with the genius problem solving, that all makes sense with little to no plot holes, and their ability to convey this complex message in such a simple way. I mean, the show literally explains the horrors of war to children. And in this live action translation of Avatar: The Last Airbender, they almost, I feel like they forgo the arcs almost completely, or they rush them. I feel like I don't notice any of the characters learning, and a lot in the main show, in the original show, what makes it so good and what makes these arcs so good is that we see them learning. We're not told. We're not told through conversation that they learn these things. We see them learning these things. Aang starts off in this show very serious, so we don't get to see him in his struggle to mature and take over this insane task he has to do. Sokka isn't really sexist, so we don't get to see him learn the lesson that women can also be as strong. Katara is very level-headed, so we don't get to see much of her learning moral strength and ferociousness. And a big part I loved about her character was her anger. And that was kind of taken away in this a little bit. I also think that they made Zuko a little bit less interesting by, making him maybe not as passionate with his main motivation, which is, to get his father's approval. I do love Dallas Liu, the actor. He did a great job, though. I did love him. He crushed it. He was a great, I was like, oh, he's a brat. He's a bratty 16-year-old.
Yeah.
And I remember watching this and I was like, oh, imagine taking orders from a 16-year-old. That's gotta suck. It really put it in
he really nailed that. I was born as a prince. This is my role.
Oh yeah.
And you could tell that he came from that privilege, which was nice. He definitely nailed that.
He definitely really nailed that. And it was, what I do like that they did in this live action is you get to see that more and understand, you really see their age. You really see how young they are. And you really see how grumpy these kids are.
Yeah.
And I loved that, but it's not the actor's fault. I never think it's the actor's fault, but I think
the writing didn't
justify that.
Yeah, the writing didn't give them, I think, the space that they kind of needed to, like you were saying, grow into the arcs that we know they're supposed to go on. Like you were saying, I think that the writing in this is, I think, my main problem with the thing as a whole. And I don't want to just talk about my dislikes of it, because I did enjoy it, admittedly, more than I thought I was going to.
Way more than I thought. Oh my God.
I went into this and I was very I'm not going to have a good time, which I didn't want to go into it thinking that, but I was I was just so worried, and so didn't think that it was going to be enjoyable. And it was enjoyable, I think.
Yes.
And I think especially, I saw some people talking about it, and I agree with this. It's so hard to detach it from the animated series and just take it on its face value. And I think that if the animated series didn't exist and we just had this, it's a solid show, but I do still think that the problems that are there, are there regardless of it being an adaptation. They just, I think, get exacerbated when you add in the fact that it is an adaptation of something that does those things so exceptionally well in the original format. The biggest problem that I have with this show is that it doesn't seem like it trusts its audience to have
Yes.
intelligence, like emotional or otherwise, it just explains everything to you over and over and over, and like shows you and tells you, as opposed to just like letting you live in it and like understand how the things are going, and then like seeing the characters grow naturally or
Mhm.
seeing the arcs kind of happen. Instead of that happening, like you were saying, they just like tell you that the character has grown in this way or has learned this thing,
Mhm.
as opposed to like seeing them do that, which I think is a really, it's tough, and it's also a weird feeling considering by the end of the season a lot of the things feel rushed, even though
Mhm.
this season is technically a longer runtime than like the animated season
Yeah.
one is, which is
It's
wild.
a disservice to the
Yeah.
original. It's a disservice to the actors, and it's almost offensive to all the hard work everybody put into making this look as good as it did.
Yeah, because it
And
does look really good. I think
yeah,
the some of
given
my
the
like qualms.
circumstances.
Yeah, and I think too that like a lot of people have talked about the bending and the bending looking really good, and I think it does for the
Mhm.
most part like look great.
Yeah.
I also think that some of them, and this is more like technical stuff, like some of the choices for framing and stuff is not the best so far. But like there were other times where I was watching the action where I was like, oh, this is really great actually. Like this flows well or like feels kind of exciting. And so
Mhm.
they did do a good job there, but it really I think comes down to the writing being my biggest like I'm not sure on some of this.
Mhm.
There were liberties that I think they took in the middle with like combining a bunch of episodes,
Yeah.
and like I liked the changes that they made. I thought that it made sense like in the vacuum of the story that they were
Mhm.
telling there. But then you kind of zoom out and think about it, and because of those changes, you're also sacrificing a lot of the stuff that those changes would have brought further down the line, like with those character arcs. And so it's a kind of like give and take there. And I'm not sure that it's entirely worth it with the way that they plotted everything out and kind of what they decided to like pick and choose. Like there's a lot of things from
Mhm.
season two that they put into this
Yeah.
season one, which I'm not entirely sure. Like I get like Azula and May and Ty Lee, like they're in this season, which they're not in the animated season one at all,
Yeah.
right? And I get that they're incredibly popular characters, and so it makes sense for an adaptation to want to introduce them immediately because obviously there's a ton of fans for them,
Mhm.
and so that makes sense. But by doing that, you're taking the screen time away from Team Avatar, which you really need in that first season. Like the reason that it feels like Team Avatar and that we're like with them the whole time is because we do spend that entire like 8 hour runtime of season one basically just with Team Avatar.
Yeah,
And
just
so
learning
by
about them and
yeah, like we're the showrunners I know talked about wanting to like talked about not having time to do all of those like little side quests and stuff that the team goes on in the middle of the season, which like I get, but also you did have the time. You just chose to give it to
yeah, you just chose to give it to
other
these
things.
monologues that are unnecessary and almost feel like what I feel happened is their heart was in the right place, but I think the execution and what it felt like was it felt like executives and money got their hands on this and took over it, and greed took over this, and it stained it, and it made it, it took away that heart and it took away that true core to
Mm-hmm.
it. Like a lot of it felt like I was like, you're shoving so much from season two in this. I feel like they're trying to get all of this. Like they're like, oh, we might only have one season, so let's shove as much as we can in this so we can keep everybody interested, and please the fans and do this fan service and oh, like they'll all know these little characters, but it wasn't necessary. We all liked the original because
Mm-hmm.
everything they did, we were like, oh, it's a lesson in story writing. It's literally
Yeah,
how to write a story. Like that's one of the best examples. And
they just lose
they're
that
just not
here.
they just lose that. They're not focusing on
Yeah,
it.
it's one of the things like I can't count the amount of times in this season that as I was watching and the dialogue was happening, I said the line for what would be the next line of dialogue beforehand because I was like,
Yes.
oh, well, it's just obvious where they're going with this. Like
Where
it's
they're
the most,
going.
yeah, it's the most like basic like 101 like, oh, I know what response is going to be here, which is not the best feeling. Like it feels kind of
Yeah.
cool and you're like, oh yeah, called it, but that's not, you don't actually want that though while you're
I don't
watching the
want
show,
that.
right? Like
I want to
I
be
will,
surprised. Yeah.
yeah, and I want it to be more like I want it to be engaging in a different way. I want it to be like emotionally engaging, not like game show engaging where I'm like, oh
Game
yeah, I
show
guess
engaging.
like I guessed it right. Cool. Like that's not.
I think I wrote somewhere here. It makes this is what I wrote when I was watching it. I said it makes me feel like they're treating me like I'm stupid and I won't understand what's going on if I'm not spoon fed this information. And then I said if I wanted to watch something without using my brain, I would watch reality TV.
Yeah, it's like I think a good example of it is the decision to show the genocide of the air nomads, like to open.
That was interesting. I did like that.
The show, like I thought, again, it was a cool sequence. I thought it made sense how they like had all the air nomads in one spot to like gather for the Comet Festival. I thought that was cool. And like again, it makes sense in the context of the show and the story and what they decided to do for the adaptation. But then when you zoom out and look at it, like that's the first 30 minutes of the show. Like they spent 30 minutes there. And that's the first episode of the animated show where we're getting introduced to, you know, Sokka and Katara and Aang and like learning how they are, like who they are as characters. And like we get so much of what will then inform their arcs for the entire show from that first 30 minutes. And you just don't really get that. Like you get some of it with Aang, of course, because he's present. But it's one of those things, again, where in the animated show, it just starts you out not at like chronologically the beginning of the story, but like where you need to be for the beginning of the story. And then it trusts the audience that when that we'll get to that point. Like we will get to the point where you'll figure out what happened and you'll get the information that you need there, as opposed to like upfront being like, hey, here's everything that's
here's
going
the
down.
whole timeline.
Yeah, like here's what you need to know.
Like that's not interesting.